democracy. It has underpinned 100 years of rapid social, technological and economic progression, and is the single greatest example of military, economic and cultural expansionism in the history of the world. Since the Second World War, Western nations have pushed the economic and social constructs that underpin democracy to the farthest reaches of the globe. But something is changing. The rise of international markets such as China and Africa, along with a spike in nationalism and social tensions in the West, are challenging democratic governments every day. Among these challenges is another force that will see democracy change into something new entirely: digitalisation. In this series, we've shown how the fourth industrial revolution is underpinning a rapid shift in the ways people interact with their government, the economy, and most importantly, each other, driving a fundamental and existential change to how democracies work. Welcome to the Consumerocracy. Digital communication channels have empowered consumers to change the ways they interact with each other, companies, and the government. At the same time, digital currency and online trading increasingly allow companies to bypass government regulators, while digital Goliaths such as Facebook and Google are now able to manipulate consumer opinions and market dynamics at nearly unfathomable speeds. On their own, each of these changes represents a serious challenge for traditional democracies, and through their combination, could reasonably affect social stability in Western democracies and could potentially lead to a long-term decline in social stability and the standard of living. But while stability in the West has recently suffered, this is mainly a result of the GFC and some of the challenges associated with immigration and automation of the workforce. And a number of academics, including Steven Pinker, have noted the standard of living in the Western world has actually improved. And in many cases, social progression is moving faster than at any other time in history. For example, the Me Too movement is an incredible case study of social progression sweeping across the business world, leading to structural changes in a number of traditional industries. So the question is, why? Despite many democratic principles being eroded, aren't we seeing a more rapid decline in social outcomes in the Western world? Well, we have a hypothesis. In the middle of the 20th century, as globalization began to take hold, industry observers and academics noticed a trend. Consumers tend to reject companies who operate in ethically questionable ways. Vexed consumers and market regulators often become so jaded with badly behaved corporations, they would stop purchasing their products altogether, threatening the sustainability of business models. The literature around this trend became known as corporate social responsibility, or CSR for short, and since the second half of the last century, it has become a cornerstone in the decision-making process for multinational organisations. CSR seeks to create sustainable profits by making decisions that factor in a company's impact on society and the environment. Beyond simply appealing to consumers, CSR has a highly functional business purpose. By operating in a manner that is seen to be ethical, corporations can reduce the level of regulatory scrutiny from governments. Although CSR has been a dominant concept for many years now, in the digital age we are seeing it fundamentally change. In a TEDx talk in 2016, Rachel Hutchison, then VP of Corporate Citizenship and Philanthropy at Blackbaud, argued that CSR is now being replaced by a new paradigm: human social responsibility. Hutchison argued that while CSR has traditionally been led by the C-suite in a top-down approach, a human social responsibility framework looks to engage consumers as well as frontline employees, in managing the day-to-day social responsibilities of an organisation and governments. And this has a number of implications that go beyond simple profit generation. For example, many HR departments must now factor in social responsibility when looking to attract talent. According to a 2015 study by the consultancy Global Tolerance, more than 44% of people in the UK felt doing meaningful work that helped others was more important than a high salary. And 62% of millennials want to work for a company that has a positive impact on society. At a consumer level, supply chain management is also being heavily affected by the human social responsibility framework, with consumers wanting to know that corporations they support source their products from ethical providers. For business management, these are fascinating developments, but I hear you asking, what does it have to do with democracy? Well, we believe the fusion of this new human social responsibility paradigm will merge with the aging construct of democracy, and from the ashes of the early 21st century, we will see a new mode of governance arise, the consumerocracy. In the consumerocracy, the people will take an active role in governance by prosecuting social and economic outcomes through digital channels. This has always been the ideal of democracy, but the historical limitations of communications technology has meant we've always relied on elected representatives to interpret and prosecute the will of the people. While there are many real-world examples of the consumerocracy already, we expect the transition to grow steadily in the 21st century until it eventually replaces democracy altogether. Now, before we push on, the rest of this episode is based on our analysis from the last 4 episodes. If you'd like to listen to those episodes before going any further, hit pause now and we'll see you back here in an hour or so. So let's start by looking at some of the potential impacts of the consumerocracy. Because of the sheer scale of what we're discussing, we'll focus on 2 key areas today: social decision making and policy outcomes. At a governmental level, we believe decision making will become far more decentralised over the next 80 years. One of the things that has made Western democracy so effective is its separation of powers. Essentially, important macro-level decision-making is divided amongst 3 distinct branches: the legislative, who design laws and regulations; the judicial, who interpret laws and adjudicate disputes; and the executive, who physically enforce the will of the state. The separation of powers has a number of benefits. Firstly, it helps reduce corruption by moving power away from a single corruptible agent, such as a despot. Secondly, the separation of powers helps provide a pressure valve, which reduces the likelihood of violence when actors in a society clash. So while the separation of powers has been a highly effective model, the rising speed and interconnectedness of Western societies means these old world systems are, in many cases, being superseded by consumercratic systems. Let's look at some examples. From a legislative perspective, laws and regulations are traditionally developed by elected officials to address changes in a society. These representatives learn about important changes from academic and industry experts or from concerned constituents. From there, they develop and debate potential solutions before voting on implementation. Historically, this has been an effective form of governance by ensuring issues are well considered and solutions don't have adverse or unexpected consequences. But recent developments in communications technology has highlighted how slow the process is. In an increasingly digitalised world, by the time legislative representatives have identified an issue, workshopped a solution, and debated and voted on it, the context of the issue will have often shifted, meaning that, at the very least, the agreed solution is no longer optimal. In 2017, video game publisher EA released the latest installment of their popular Star Wars Battlefront franchise, featuring a paid loot boxing system which gave users the ability to purchase goods within the game using a chance-based system. From a legal standpoint, loot boxing is a grey area, in part due to the slow speed at which legislators have addressed the issue. But many consumers and experts around the world consider it to be a form of gambling. EA's use of loot boxes in Battlefront became a controversial topic, partly because the game is so heavily geared towards children. The incident kicked off two separate conversations. The first was within legislatures across the globe, with governments in Belgium, Hawaii and Australia choosing to investigate the legality of loot boxes. 12 months later, relatively little has been achieved by this investigation, with only Belgium taking action against the company so far. And in this case, legislators are relying on fairly ambiguous gaming laws that arguably don't directly address loot boxes. The second conversation has been led by consumers. Within days of the game's release, there was a massive reaction via digital and social media, with many openly arguing that despite technically being legal, the loot boxes in Star Wars Battlefront breached social norms by preying on young consumers and people who are susceptible to gambling addiction. Unlike the legislative conversation, this led to very real consequences for EA, including a partial boycott of the game. The result of this blowback was incredible. Disney, the owner of the Star Wars intellectual property, forced EA to remove loot boxes from the game, while a negative reaction from investors saw EA lose more than $3 billion in value. This process took 11 days. By engaging with digital channels, consumers were able to debate and implement a new social norm quicker than any legislator. Now, it's important to note this is a single incident, and loot boxes remain a popular form of monetization in video games. However, this consumercratic outcome could set a precedent that private and public sector organisations won't be able to ignore. At a judicial level, large disputes are usually decided in a structured court case or through arbitration, where evidence is produced and evaluated by qualified judges or juries in an objective and robust manner. But this process can also be quite slow and often doesn't return the popular outcomes that people want. Social media vigilantes are now starting to bypass the judicial system by allowing people to review evidence and debate a person's guilt or innocence in real time. Now, trial by media isn't anything new, but being trialed on social media is something different entirely. Traditionally, mainstream media have been restricted in the evidence they can present to viewers, and usually, the evidence they do present is discussed by panels of journalists and experts. When these outlets misrepresent facts, they can be sued for defamation, helping ensure the judicial system maintains its integrity and ultimate control over the case. But by taking the conversation away from traditional media and experts, and opening it up to the public through digital channels, we are seeing control start to move towards consumers. Let's look at a couple of real-world examples. The Me Too movement recently saw a large number of men in the US entertainment sector identified as potential perpetrators of sexualized violence. While the justice system in the US has taken a long time to lay charges against these men, consumers have had an active discussion about the evidence presented by the alleged victims and, in many cases, made a popular verdict. A great example is the cases of Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey, who have both been found guilty in the court of public opinion. At the executive level, evidence of criminal activity has historically been collected and analysed by professional law enforcement. Once that evidence has been reviewed and a judicial decision has been made, it becomes their responsibility to actually enforce these decisions. This is changing though. Consumers are now becoming more active in collecting and analysing evidence themselves. Even about the executive branch, it is now common practice for citizens to film police when they are making an arrest. The arrest is then often uploaded to social media and discussed by users to determine if they feel the police have transgressed their powers. As we stated earlier, the executive branch also has the responsibility of enforcing laws. And while we've not seen a huge amount of disruption by the consumerocracy in this area yet, there are early examples of online vigilante groups such as Anonymous identifying companies they feel have transgressed social norms and executing their own brand of technological justice. It's important to note, we aren't talking about hacking, but a situation where a large number of consumers are energized to use online channels to punish people and companies they feel have transgressed societal norms. Going forward, we expect this trend will also expand, although we have no idea of knowing to what extent. So now we've established that a structural change is occurring, let's look at things at a policy level. This is where we feel the most interesting changes are going to come. Over the next 80 years, we expect to see the people become more integrated in the day-to-day function of government systems, particularly in relation to corporations. As this happens, the concept of being a constituent and a consumer will merge. And this is why the consumerocracy is so different to free market economics employed in the West during the 20th century. Consumers aren't going to just migrate between suppliers as postulated in the CSR literature. Instead, they are already becoming actively involved in the real-time determination of what players in an economy should and should not be allowed to do. They are also active in delivering the verdicts and the outcomes associated with social transgressions. Let's revisit our real-world example of Kevin Spacey. Following the Me Too movement, consumers, by and large, perceived that Spacey was guilty of transgressing accepted social norms. As a result, Spacey has been punished through extreme economic vigilantism. His most recent film, Billionaire Boys Club, grossed only $425 at the US box office on its opening weekend. An almost unbelievable outcome for a former global superstar whose previous film Baby Driver brought in more than $20 million on its opening weekend. So in this example, the Me Too movement has encouraged consumers to treat Spacey as if he is guilty of a social transgression. And this is interesting because Me Too is heavily aligned with feminism, a paradigm that is more left-leaning in its egalitarian philosophy, by postulating the government has an onus to ensure equality of opportunity for people within a society. However, the Me Too movement didn't leverage governmental systems to punish Spacey. Instead, constituents used social media to rapidly mobilise individuals against Spacey, punishing him for his perceived transgressions without government intervention. Upon observation, we can see this is a fairly right-leaning approach. That is, the market determined what is and is not socially acceptable, essentially a human-led social responsibility framework. And we are seeing these types of consumercratic behaviours emerge across the Western world. And while this is an evolution on the traditional free market model, it is far more than simple capitalism. Many of the people attacking Spacey online aren't fans or even people within his target audience, which would be the case under a pure free market economic system. So how does this translate at a policy level? As we've established, government budgets are likely to decline in the 21st century. At the same time, supply lines across the world are becoming more transient, making it extremely difficult to regulate market outcomes. As a result, a highly powerful digital hegemony is starting to take form in companies like Google, Amazon, and Apple. And while at the moment these companies are relatively socially friendly, international political theory tells us that in an unchecked environment, benevolent hegemons eventually become predatory. And governments are trying to determine how they can respond to this threat. The consumerocracy, provides them with the ability to achieve this. Now, we're not entirely certain how this will manifest throughout the century, but we do believe governments will actively look for policies that leverage and help energize the power of consumers. Indeed, there are a number of early examples of consumercratic policies that could evolve over coming years. One example is customer experience management. Governments often use customer surveys to evaluate industry partners managing large government services such as transport. Customers will rate the company's performance on predetermined KPIs such as service quality. If the service provider fails to meet previously agreed levels, they can be penalised under the terms of the contract. But this approach is beginning to be disrupted in the digital age, with many providers now developing real-time and agile data solutions, allowing consumers to determine what is important to them rather than simply answering according to predetermined KPIs. In the consumerocracy, we could see governments go even further. In coming years, governments may look to integrate systems such as Google ratings as part of mandatory quarterly reporting for publicly listed companies, and fine those companies who don't maintain a certain level of service rating. As another hypothetical example, government representatives could potentially choose to have the topics of parliamentary debates aligned to the highest trending issues on social media in the last 24 hours, although they'd obviously need to be careful not to end up discussing the Bachelor finale on the floor of Congress. Alternatively, legislators could leverage large online and real-time forums such as Reddit to inform the development of legislative initiatives much quicker, an extension to the Green Deal's concept outlined in the last episode. These initiatives would ensure lawmakers are discussing the most relevant topics and keeping up with contextual changes in the market. Now, while all of these may sound like crazy ideas, the great thing is technology and machine learning are making them all possible. And it won't stop there. This century could realistically see consumers integrated into almost all regulatory decisions across the Western world. While there will no doubt be a lot of positives and negatives to the consumerocracy, it's also important to acknowledge and address the risks for society. In an ideal democratic system, governments draw on experts to inform their decision-making, helping achieve the best possible outcomes. And that's not to say we always get it right, but on the balance of things, it's historically been quite effective. We expect this to change in a consumercratic system, with a person's voice on an issue weighted more heavily on their number of Twitter followers, rather than their education or experience. Similarly, message optimization gives digital firms the ability to influence public policy by controlling the flow of information to consumers. If we're going to make the consumerocracy work, we need to commit to getting it right and managing the risks. And the best way to do that is through education and proactive dialogue. We need to teach people how to stay informed and why it is so important. I believe we can do it. Since the Declaration of Independence, people across the Western world have shown a dedication to self-determination. And we see no indication that this is going to end. Movements like Me Too represent the best of us, even if they aren't perfect. But change is coming. In the first 20 years of the 21st century, we've seen rapid social and economic changes. And while none of us can predict the future, it's clear that technological advancement is continuing at a rapid pace. The fourth industrial revolution has a huge amount in store, and this will continue to impact the way people interact with their governments and the way they respond to the people. There is also another technological revolution looming on the horizon, artificial intelligence, which could change the political landscape of the world once again, potentially rendering the human collective obsolete from the political process altogether. However, that's a conversation for another day. Until next time, I'm Chris Shirley, and I'll see you in the Consumerocracy.